evening. It is wonderful to see this place so full, and I feel very honored to welcome you all to our synagogue. Welcome to Congregation Beth Shalom. I know many of you are here to listen to Lori's story, to listen to Lori's music, and to learn more about Lori's family. For some of you, it's a religious obligation to be here, because Jews are called to remember and never to forget. As many of these stories as we can learn throughout our lifetime. So within our community, we're holding a handful of members who are direct descendants of Holocaust survivors. We have Dan Lori here in the first row, who last year, for the same date of the calendar, told us about the story of him. And today, it is Lori's turn. There are several of these days throughout the Jewish calendar. Today, tonight, begins the 27th of Nisan, which is Holocaust Memorial Day globally, but especially in the state of Israel. So we're joining here Lori's story and the memory of 6 million in the shape of those burning candles on the stage. And other than that, I'm just very honored to have here tonight Lori Rosolowski, creator, musician, creative mind, and beating heart of this evening, and Kyle Sorensen and Amy Leach. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here, and for those of you joining from many time zones through Zoom, I really appreciate your presence. As Rabbi Sonia said, this is a very personal program from the heart, and I couldn't have done it alone, by no means. My older sister Carol conducted interviews with our father. You're going to see interviews from a Holocaust historian, and what you're going to see is a compilation of family photos from many generations. So I'm indebted to all of our relatives for keeping the family tree alive via these media, and I'm so eager to share it with you tonight. It's a real honor to do so. Our relatives' lives were important, and their life lessons live on in everyone they touched, which was a lot of people. You know what? Does that help? Great. And those stands will leave the stage when the musicians come and go. So thank you for noticing. You've improved things immeasurably in the first 60 seconds, Dan. So my family, like so many families, touched so many people in their lives. And those of us who are still here still do. The story I'm going to share is a universal story. It's an immigrant story. It's a rags to riches story. It's about giving back, all of it. The tragedy is, of course, how many other lives were cut short. What would their legacies have been? We ask these questions today in Ukraine, in Gaza, on our border, everywhere people are fleeing. I began exploring my family's history only about 12 years ago. And if you remember none of the details from today, I hope today's program will inspire you to explore your own stories. The first part of our program will begin with my great uncles, Herbert and Alfred Frum. And these were my great uncles on my mom's side. And Charlie and Tommy, if you guys want to come up front, you're good? Okay. saved you seats, but that's okay. Okay. Herbert Fromm, the gentleman on stage right, so on your left, was a renowned Jewish composer, and his twin brother, shown here, is Alfred Fromm. Herbert's arrangement of Kol Nidre is one of the most sacred pieces that we hear in the Jewish tradition. We hear it on the night before Yom Kippur, and his arrangement of it is performed every year around the world. And he earned the first Ernest Bloch Award. In the early Nazi years, artists of all kinds were starting to be sequestered into something that became known as the Kubu, or the Kulturbund. And it was, you can think of it as a separate but almost equal type of arrangement that the Nazis cleverly devised so that they could keep the Jews monitored, and the Jews could keep doing what they were doing, whether it was theater, music, dance, visual arts, writing, poetry. And what this did was allow many Jews in the early Nazi days to stay in Nazi Germany a lot longer than they would have, because things were fine. It was really hard to see the writing on the wall. And this impacted Herbert. He did stay, and he was happy with his wife Lainey creating art. And so the first piece of music that we're going to share with you today is something that Herbert wrote while he was involved in the Kubu, the Kulturbund. And what this piece we're going to share is part of his Palestine poems, and it's called Numi Numi, and it means cradle song. And it's a mother singing to her baby, singing a lullaby, and some of the words refer to the father who works in the vineyards. And our family was a wine family. So I believe that's why Herbert chose to set those words to music. And that's what we want to share with you to start.
ישוב עם צדה לבנה, יביא לך מתנה. נומי נומי ילדתי, נומי נומי נום, נומי נומי קטנתי, נומי נומי נום. הבא
that was from Herbert, and as I mentioned, his twin brother Alfred was in the wine business. Herbert didn't make much money in music, but Alfred did in wine. Not surprising. So he and his wife Hannah became philanthropists, and they helped people emigrate to Israel. They also founded the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning because a friend of Alfred's approached him the day he turned 65 and one day and said, "I'm no longer relevant. This is a problem." And Alfred and Hannah put their heads together and said, that needs to be fixed. So they started the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning, and they were friends with Bernard Osher. And Bernie said to him, like, I want to franchise this idea. So there are now 125 OLLIs, as they're called, Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes. And Bozeman's at MSU is the last one, the most recent one. My husband, Mark, helped bring that about, helped getting the grant for that to happen, and along with many others. And so it's kind of cool how things are coming full circle for us. And when we moved here 8 years ago in 2016, joining what was then known as Wonderlust and now is Ollie, was how Mark and I integrated ourselves into the community because we wanted to find people who were about our age, who were still interested in learning for the rest of our lives, which we are. Well, both Herbert and Alfred were also instrumental in my parents' wedding. And my parents' wedding was the culmination of many miraculous events. A ton of good luck that many others in their situation did not have. And that's why this program is called Miraculous Escapes from Germany. Herbert wrote their wedding march, and Alfred and Hannah hosted their wedding on their vineyards in California. And so here they are, Ernest Simon and Eve Meyer, but we pronounced it Mayer once the family moved to this country. So they got married in June of 1953, and now Amy and I are going to play just a tiny excerpt of this wedding march. And Herbert based it on a Hasidic melody, and it sounds very Jewish. It's easy to pick out Jewish melodies. So that's the beginning of it, and then there's lots of intermediate stuff, so all the bridesmaids, etc., could do their thing. And then we're going to play the last bit of it. So, although it's somber, it ends with a musical ray of sunshine. And perhaps Herbert chose to do that to honor the hopefully very happy journey that my future parents were going to embark on. And perhaps it was also a reflection of what it had taken for them and their parents to get here. So how did that journey begin? Well, let's start with the escape of the Simon family, which was my father's side. That's a picture of my dad, Ernie, the littler guy, and his older brother, Harold. They didn't get along very well when they were little kids. There was about an 18-month difference between them, and lots of skin knees and other things, but it ended up okay. So their mom, my grandmother Hedvig, had sensed that their family should leave as early as 1933. She was noticing changes in the schools. Jewish kids were being banned from public school. By then, the family started seeing Hitler Youth marching in the streets. But the Simon family did not leave until much later. Why? Well, one reason in our case was that my grandpa Fritz had fought for Germany in the First World War. And why would his country turn against him? And who could imagine what was to come? So it wasn't until 1938 that they started making plans. In this video excerpt, my dad shares a conversation that his dad, Fritz, had with a non-Jewish colleague. It went something like this.
Let's take a walk in the park. So my father, Fritz, and this non-Jewish gentleman took a walk, and the man told my father, says, if this conversation were overheard, you and I are both dead men.
Wow.
The band told my father, get your family out. Things are not getting better and are going to get worse.
And so the family began to make plans and do the paperwork. And as most of you know, to move to another country, you need visas and you need sponsors in the receiving country. So they did all that, and they had a hitch because their older sister, Harold and Ernest's older sister Edith, was studying abroad in England, and so they had to get her back and do the paperwork for that. But they did it. And so this was 1938. Now, if it had been 1940, there were very serious anti-immigration policies being implemented. The Secretary of State, Breckinridge Long, was responsible for those. And he is quoted as, there's writings that he says he wants to use various administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of the visas. So, another miracle. Because Fritz was tipped off earlier than 1940, they had time for Edith to return from England, where she'd been studying, get the paperwork done, and the family left together. They left Germany on August 17th, 1938, taking a train to Switzerland. That date is epic for our family, but it's also epic in world history, because on that date, the German government issued an edict that legal documents had to include the middle name of Israel for males and Sarah for females. And it would take effect 3 months later, in January 1st of 1939. So in the next excerpt, my father refers to this new law and its significance.
Our passports were issued before that date and don't have that name, but I'm sure that Eve's passports and their parents did have, but those were lost, and I have not seen them. The reason I mention that as far as is known, this is the first time in recorded history that a government intruded itself in the naming of children.
So, after getting to Holland, the family boarded the New Amsterdam for America. And here is a picture of the ship that they sailed on. There are a few anecdotes about this that are humorous. My grandmother, Hedvig, the one who sensed they should leave, but her husband didn't really pay attention right away, she was an Orthodox Jew, and she would not board a conveyance on the Sabbath. So she convinced the captain to let her board early, which he did. She always got her way. When they traveled, there was the great New England hurricane of 1938. It could have been devastating. They lost their marbles, shall we say, but not their lives. So it was another miracle, and they made it. They arrived a week later, again on the Sabbath. So, of course, my grandmother did not want to deboard the conveyance, at which point the captain said, well, that would be just fine, but then she'd be heading back to Europe with him. And luckily, either she came to her senses or the family just yanked her off. I am not sure. But so anyway, that's how they got here. An interesting and important fact is that the great writer Thomas Mann, M-A-N-N, was on the ship with them, and they befriended him and his family. And it wasn't important to the Nazi regime that my relatives were leaving. They weren't a big name in any way. But the fact that a Nobel laureate and his family were leaving was a black eye for Hitler. And so, you know, things were starting to be noticed. A cool connection that I learned about was that both my Uncle Harold and my dad Ernie took violin from Thomas Mann's son. However, neither of them became very accomplished in that regard, to my knowledge. At least my dad didn't. So they arrived in fall of 1938. And then they sailed to San Francisco, seeing the Golden Gate Bridge for the first time. So my Aunt Edith, their big sister, has a really neat story that we're going to share with you.
It was a funny incident when we arrived. The customs man came aboard, and I had an accordion along. And the first thing he did was to light into that accordion and said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's an accordion." He said, "Whose is it?" I said, "It's mine." He said, "You're going to sell it?" I said, "No, I'm going to keep it because I play it." He said, "Prove it." So I played "God Bless America." And the customs agent cried, and all the people down at the pier, our relatives, cried. So it was a good moment.
So the family arrived in San Francisco just 9 days before Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And had they not been out of Germany on that night, it's almost certain that my grandfather Fritz would have been carted off and killed. They left in the nick of time. Sorry. Okay. Technology. Alrighty. No, sorry. There we go. So my grandpa Fritz had a lot of guilt for waiting so long to leave. And you may wonder why he had guilt. Well, even though he wasn't famous like Thomas Mann, he was a community leader in their small town of Karlsruhe, and people looked to him for guidance. So if he had listened to his wife, and if he had gotten the family out sooner, perhaps others would have left sooner as well. So what did he do when he got here? He spent his first months or so here trying desperately to save other families. And there's there's a letter that we're going to show you a copy of, which somewhere in there it says address unknown, but basically this is a letter that was not able to be delivered because the recipient was no longer alive. And there is a book called Address Unknown, which has been translated into dozens of languages that chronicles the exact thing that my grandfather was trying to do. And we have it that he tried to save 120 families, and he was able to save 60, but not the other 60. So my dad bought a model of the ship, the New Amsterdam, that took their family to freedom. And here is what it looks like. It's still in where my mom lives, and there's only 4 of these in the whole world. So my dad bought it for a very particular reason, and he wanted to make sure that his kids would never forget that it was a luxury liner that brought his family to freedom and life instead of a cattle car that took them one way to Auschwitz and death. He choked up when he talked about it.
I keep this ship and the train and a book on the Holocaust from the Holocaust Museum, which interestingly enough has a picture of one of the cattle cars, and the name on the cattle car is Karlsruhe.
Wow.
And my journey to America was almost a cruise, and then my education in the United States was an excellent.
So both my dad, Ernest Simon, and my uncle, Harold Simon, became medical doctors and helped found medical schools. My dad at UNM in Albuquerque, my uncle Harold in San Diego, UCSD. So they used their good fortune for good. Here's a picture of Harold in 2013 with my dad. This was their last visit together. Harold died in 2013. And my dad died in 2020. He was my moral compass, and his spirit guides me every day. So I wrote this song in tribute to him, and Amy will once again join me. When once I erred and paid the price, you gently shared your sage advice, a masterpiece both tender and concise and precise. And when my mind took leave of me, you helped me find my sanity, your heart a reservoir of empathy just for me. And so I practiced through the years to have your eyes, to have your ears, to drink your words till they were mine, just like you spoke them at the other end of the line. Our daily calls, our history turned into fall. So now, let's turn to the dramatic escape of my mom's side of the family. My mom, Eve, and her big brother, Peter, spent their early years in the little German town of Bingen on the Rhine. They lived in this apartment building. You can see the vineyards. And here's some photos of their family, Peter and Eve as little kids. Their mom, Joan, I think is next. My middle name is Joan, after her. There's Bear, Opa. He was only 5 feet tall, just like me at my peak. There's Mom, a little bit older. And then Peter as a young boy, and then a little bit older. So, Peter Mayer, we're going to learn a lot about him. Peter was 3 years older than my mom, Eve, and he suffered abuse as a Jewish boy in a Christian school. He wrote in his memoir, "We left just before it hit the fan." And here is an excerpt of the excerpt. As he writes in his memoir, "We didn't have a passport or an exit visa, so my parents just put me on the train with my sister to have us sent to an orphanage in Belgium. I was probably 9 or 10, and Eve was 3 years younger. When the Gestapo came through our car, we would tell them that our parents were in the dining car with our papers. We had rehearsed that endlessly. My parents would say to me, 'What are you going to tell the police when they come?' 'My parents are in the dining car,' Peter would say. 'And what if they ask for papers?' their parents would ask. 'My parents have them,' Peter would rehearse saying. Peter writes, 'The police believed me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Our parents weren't on the train at all, and we had no papers, but we did have a ticket, so the police bought our story and let us cross the border.' Now, what we'll never know is whether they knew, the police knew, and they let it slide, or they bought their story. Peter did become a very successful lawyer, so it's hard to know. So, let's see. So they got out, and they were not turned back. Peter and Eve lived in an orphanage for a year, but they were poorly fed and poorly treated. Peter was old enough to assume that he wouldn't see his parents again. But their dad, my grandpa, Opa, had a travel visa. He was in the wine business as well, and he would travel all the time. So he had that, and he was able to find them. Their mom, my grandma Joan, apparently walked across land that was mined, crossed a border, and found them. I'm really not sure how it worked, but she did. It's mind-boggling. And the family was reunited. It was another miracle for us. The Mayer family then moved to Amsterdam and waited for their visas. Paul Frum, another brother of Alfred and Herbert, had already gotten to America and established a business, and he was able to provide their affidavits. As an 11-year-old boy who suffered so much already, Peter was aware of his mortality much younger than most. While living in Amsterdam, he carved his name and the dates 1928 to 1939 in the building where they lived. The family sailed from Rotterdam to New York, arriving on Thanksgiving Day, 1939. Of course, Peter had never heard of this holiday and exclaimed, "Isn't it amazing that everybody's giving thanks that the Mayer family has arrived in the United States?" They brought $10 a person and no belongings. And I just like to pause for a moment because I think we have a 10 or 11-year-old in the audience, and we all know 11-year-olds. And can you imagine in this day and age an 11-year-old being able to be that resourceful and poised and get himself and his little sister out of a dangerous situation. And maybe Dan did it back in the day. But in this day and age, we're so protective of our youngsters that it's just kind of hard to imagine. So there's that. Peter's story. Oh, let me scroll forward. So now I want to show you a picture of the Penland. That was the ship that they traveled on. It was later converted to a troop ship and sunk by the Germans. Peter's story is a classic immigrant story. He was a child in Nazi Germany, abused in an orphanage, started out poor in America, bullied as a Jew in Chicago. It could have broken him. Instead, he worked odd jobs to get through his education, and he joked that he majored in survival. He became a favorite law professor at Stanford and Bolt law schools in California. He was a philanthropist. He never retired. He gave back in time and money and skill. And he always let us know that the lesson of his escape from the Holocaust is to pay attention. He championed education as the ticket to one's survival. He championed education even late in life. If you recall that Hannah and Alfred Fromm, his uncle, started the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning, where, well, Peter Fromm took it over and headed it for decades and taught at the Fromm Institute for decades as well. Peter K. Mayer died on December 21st, 2021, fittingly the shortest and darkest day of the year. Our family has a million favorite stories of our Uncle Peter. This one sums up his drive and his values. Again, this comes from his memoirs. As a teen, it was his dream to go to Carleton College, but he got rejected. So at age 17, he took a train from Chicago to Minneapolis and then hitchhiked 40 miles to Carleton. He told the director of admissions, "You're making a big mistake. I know my grades and SAT scores are terrible, but I'm a German immigrant and I couldn't speak English, but now I can." He writes that he gave this admissions officer the whole song and dance, and the admissions director said, "Okay, come to Carleton, but on probation." So then 2 years later, Peter finds that he needs to go back to the admissions officer because he decides he's going to transfer to Berkeley. And I guess he needed some kind of letter of recommendation or something. And so he kind of admitted that he'd kind of, whatever. And so the director of admissions said, "Well, let me be frank with you." I guess what I wanted to say is he apologized for what he had said and everything and just kind of trying to sell his way into this college. So the director of admissions said, "Well, let me be frank with you. In my 30 years as a director of admissions, no student unaccompanied by his parent has ever taken the train and hitchhiked his way to Carleton College to tell me that I made a mistake in not admitting him. So when you wrote me a letter saying you were coming, I made up my mind that you were going to make it no matter what you said." Okay, so as you know, Peter saved my mom's life. She had only him as her brother. That was her only sibling. He only had her. They were close to his dying day, and he did not suffer long. Unlike my dad, who suffered for decades with chronic illness, Peter's decline was rapid, and he hadn't stopped working till the end. So, in a nutshell, this is how my future parents escaped, starting with the friend of my grandfather, the non-Jewish friend, who was on my dad's side, and the bravery of my mom's big brother. Their families thrived, and here we are. So it's time for an upbeat song, one that I wrote called Great Divide. And while Kyle and Amy return to the stage, I'll tell you how I came to write this song. Mark and I got to take a bike trip about 24 years ago to the Canadian Rockies, and it was just epic. And when we got to the Great Divide in the Canadian province where we were, we got off our bikes, and I jumped onto this little rock. It was really only as wide as my feet, as my hips. And I was noticing that the stream was bifurcating, and this side went to the Atlantic, and this side went to the Pacific, and that just sort of blew my mind. It might have been the altitude, but it really was. It was just an amazing moment to realize how little things can make the most enormous difference. And that is really the theme of so many of the anecdotes I've shared with you so far. So we are going to perform this song for you, and it is called Great Divide. Okay. I am walking the stream of the Great Divide, walking the stream only 8 feet wide, walking the stream whose water will glide to places impossible to know. I am standing on the rock of the Great Divide, standing on the rock only 1 foot wide, standing on the rock whose edges decide which way to make the water flow. Will it travel west or east? Will it bathe the land or be released? The smallest things determine fate. The smallest things I appreciate. I am facing the fork of the Great Divide, facing the fork with a view so wide, facing the fork with my legs astride, wondering which way to go. Should I venture east or west? Which direction would be best? The smallest steps determine fate. The smallest steps I contemplate. But now it's just me at the Great Divide. No more down the middle, I'm choosing a side. Turning my back on the path not tried. Heading down a one-way, heading down that road. Did that step bring more or less great divine. So we're going to turn to the last portion of our program today and focus on my Aunt Edith Simon Colliver, who was the big sister of Ernie and Hal. She's the one who played God Bless America, if you'll recall, when she first landed on American shores. Edith was ambitious and fearless. When they arrived in New York City that day, that Thanksgiving Day, she was 16, and she toured the city with her brothers like she owned the place. She ended up at UC Berkeley, majoring in international studies, and then went on to work for the War Department and the Office of War Information, which became the Defense Department. So when the need for translators and interpreters at Nuremberg arose, she was a slam dunk for the job. She was 23. So this is how she told her parents she was going to do this.
So then I wrote my parents and said I was going to go to Nuremberg. And my parents were not amused. They thought that we'd been through enough and seen enough, and you don't need to go. Well, I said I wanted to go. So my father wrote me this wonderful letter in which he said, "You belong to that generation disenfranchised by Hitler. But as you go to do justice, be just." And he also said, "Don't forget that you're a Jew."
For the Nuremberg trials, Edith interpreted back and forth between German and English. It was a demanding skill that she excelled at.
You talk while you listen, and you talk while you read. For instance, I was asked to interpret the speech of the main prosecutor, Justice Jackson, the opening speech, which was really a historic speech. You know, he said, "History will not forget what we're doing here." And I had to translate this into German. All the newspapers, American papers, and there was a very large press corps, they covered this. And the Time magazine writer wrote about the dark-haired interpreter whose voice quavers with the enormity of the situation. Well, it didn't quaver because of that, but because I was scared silly about what I was doing.
Justice Jackson's speech is considered one of the greatest opening speeches of all time. He made the now classic plea for justice. He said, "To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well." In other words, he was dedicated to ensuring that this would be a fair trial. The defendants would be presumed innocent, and the prosecution would have to find compelling evidence that the defendants were guilty. In the next clip, Edith relates her first encounter with Hermann Goering, the number 2 man under Hitler and the top man alive, because this is November and Hitler had already killed himself in April.
You were face to face with Goering.
Yeah.
Do you actually remember the first time that you laid eyes on him?
Well, in a pre-trial interrogation.
Do you remember what your impression was?
That he looked pretty sick. You know, I mean, he had a fat face, and his skin was sort of hanging down. And his clothing, he was wearing military clothing. I mean, he had dozens of uniforms. There were all sorts of German jokes about it. But he was always in full command of his potential. In interrogation in the court, he even corrected our chief prosecutor on some American history having to do with Lincoln. I forgot what it was. I mean, he was a brilliant man, Goering.
Do you remember how he spoke in German, what his style of speaking was?
Oh, yes, it was fairly explicit. For instance, when the indictment was read to them, they had to answer guilty or not guilty. And he would say, "In the sense of the indictment, not guilty." In other words, I may be guilty of some things, but not the things that they're accusing me of.
Here's what Edith said about why she wanted to go to Nuremberg.
He wasn't particularly thrilled to have a female and a Jew as an interpreter. But we were there in the interpreting room. And I did something that I regretted very much afterwards. We had a book on Nuremberg, on the building, on the people, and all that. And I asked him to autograph his picture for me. And then afterwards I went out and thought, my God, why did I give this man the honor of autographing a book? So then I felt ashamed of myself, and I went to my then boss. And so I said, write me something, because I'm ashamed about this signature. And so he wrote under it, to Edith Simon, who helped hang the same. Well, first place, I didn't help. In the second place, we didn't know whether Goering was going to be hanged. Goering was not hanged because he cheated the gallows, as you know, and killed himself during the night of the hanging. And I was with the journalists in the press room. And when the security chief of the prison came up, he looked awful. And we thought he was going to announce that the executions had been completed. He said, the defendant Goering has cheated the gallows by doing away with himself. All the journalists ran to their telephones and stuff. That was headlines.
What other defendants did you see at the trials?
Well, all of them, because they were in the room all the time. And particularly Hess, who was the number 3 man, who we thought he feigned amnesia. And so we showed a movie with him in it to see what his reaction would be, and he reacted somewhat. We also showed movies of him at the Nuremberg festivals, the Nazi festivals, the party days. And this is why actually the trial was held in Nuremberg. It was sort of the end of the period of their reign.
So as Edith reflects on her experience at Nuremberg, she shares in these video excerpts why she wanted to go.
But I went to Germany not with a sense of revenge, but with a sense of curiosity. What makes people do the things that they do?
Did you make any observations on that topic?
Well, afterwards I did. I felt that these people had become totally without conscience. And they were people who had been drilled into obeying commands.
The Nuremberg trials irrefutably documented the extent of the concentration camps and the millions who perished. Justice Jackson understood the significance of these trials in this regard. He would be appalled and dismayed about the Holocaust denial movement, just as he would be appalled and dismayed about other conspiracy theories that are rampant today. One criticism of the Nuremberg trials was that the defendants were being tried ex post facto, after the fact, since the mass murders were committed before there was actually an explicit law against it. But the trials formally defined those crimes, and later a permanent court was established to prosecute individuals for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. These interviews were conducted in 1999, right after 2 wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, in which the principles established at the Nuremberg trials were applied in the post-war trials. Sandy Colliver, who is one of Edith's 2 daughters, is a human rights lawyer who worked there. And so that's one reason that Edith referred to those countries.
But as you can see now about Bosnia and Kosovo, the legacy of Nuremberg is still with us. It was a defining experience, of course, in my life. Probably the most defining one.
One lesson from the Holocaust that applies to all of us with the means to educate ourselves is this: when you sense evil or wrong, you must attempt to nip it in the bud, or you may well be powerless to stop it. Given today's assaults on democracy and peace, these words from Edith are particularly sobering. The video excerpts today that I have shared with you are part of hours of interviews with her that are available at the Shoah Museum and online.
Many of the Germans said to us, I was only a small type. I knew from nothing. And I said, I knew when I was 11 years old. Not about the killings, they were later. Not about extermination, but about people being carted off without trial and so on. So I said, don't tell me. I knew at age 11, you must have known too. But I did believe people who said I was powerless, because we would have been powerless too.
It is easy to feel powerless. It is our responsibility to educate ourselves and act. We are not powerless. Edith Simon Colliver spent her entire life fighting for international freedom, especially as a champion of human rights. She worked with President of the Philippines, Corazon Aquino, to promote democracy there. Conversant in 7 languages, she was widely hailed as an international activist for freedom. She died in 2001 at age 79. So in the last few minutes of our program, we're going to share a Cliff Notes version of today's program, and then we will perform 2 more songs, one by Herbert and one by me. Thank you, Amy. So this is the epic photo, iconic photo that we have of our joint family at one of our many family reunions. It was taken in my parents' bathroom because that was just the best room in the house. It had the layers, you know, with the bathtub and everything, so it really worked. They don't live there anymore, otherwise we would rent it out to you for a small fee. But none of these people, the ones who are gone, the ones who were babies in 1999 and are about to get married, none of these people would be here if it hadn't been for their good fortune. And so we're going to perform Herbert's song, Anim Zmiot, which celebrates the connection between generations.
ושירים דברי בכבודך, אומר ליבי אל דודיך. ירב נא נפשי עליך, כי נפשי תערog אליך. מדי דברי בכבודך, אומר לי אל דודיך. ירב נא נפשי עליך, כי נפשי תערog
So now it's time for thank yous before one last song. Huge thanks to Casey Luxinger, our sound and tech guy. If any of you go to theater in this town, you know that Casey keeps the sound on. And he also donated this beautiful screen to the synagogue yesterday to keep. And I had the privilege of taking care of his adorable Alora yesterday, who will be the big 3.0 on the 8th, on Wednesday. So when I drove her back to their house, I discovered they live on Ernie Court. I thought that was pretty cool. And then I need to give a huge thanks also to Cody Combs of the synagogue, who makes everything work around here. Mark and I also have a son named Cody. And when I started exploring our history in about 2013, Cody was about 11. And here he is jumping into the arms of history in a park in San Francisco. And my older sister, who is never far from her camera, snapped it. So I am so grateful to the synagogue for bringing us here, to Rabbi Sonia for her warm, wonderful wisdom and energy, to Amy Leach and Kyle Sorensen, because this just wouldn't be any fun without you guys up here. And so we're going to send you out with one more song that I wrote back in 2001 as a legacy to our then only son, Kurt. I thought I wasn't going to give him stuff when it was time to give stuff away. I wanted to give him music. And but this song really speaks to my core values and my core belief that love, friendship, knowledge, and music, the more you give, the more you get. Pass it on. So, and then when we're done, there are treats in the hall. Truffles and bouquet caramels for my people who I know love them. So we want to end tonight on a note of sweetness, because without hope, there's nothing. It's just a simple little song.